So at midnight tonight, the price of petrol and diesel going up. Although inflation seems to have stabilised in the past 2 months, these increases in fuel will undoubtedly have a knock-on effect across the economy. We could be in for another rate hike soon as well, which will mean the cost of debt and borrowing is going to rise again. Let's discuss the outlook now with economist Azar Jammine. Thank you so much for joining us. Just reading about the load shedding popping back in, obviously not at the extreme levels. But I would imagine that's not going to help our economic outlook either, is it?
Unfortunately, the three factors that you mentioned are all going to hamper our economic outlook. Load shedding, higher prices due to higher fuel and food prices, and generally making life unaffordable. And then on top of that, rising interest rates for those who are carrying debt. Not a nice concoction. And on top of that, we've got the prospect of a global economy that is set to slow because they too are raising interest rates sharply, and they too are facing sharply higher inflation. So it's not a pretty picture. The best that can be said is that at least business is going on as usual, somehow managing to plan for load shedding, managing to plan for not to borrow too much, and as a consequence, the economy is at least not collapsing.
Yes.
And we are actually not the only ones. Many countries in the world are starting to feel the same pinch, except that they don't have load shedding quite to the same extent that we do, although some of them are starting to as well.
So inflation, it dropped a tiny bit, 7.5% in September, down from 7.6 in August. I mean, an optimist like me would go, oh, does that mean we've hit the top and now we're going to jump down? But the Reserve Bank governor seems to be saying, no, that's not the case. So you tell me, how long are we going to keep rising for, or are we likely to stabilise at this level?
Let me give you the good news, Sally, is I do believe that inflation peaked at 7.8% a couple of months ago. Even though fuel prices are set to rise this evening, in November last year, they rose by even more. So ironically, the inflation rate will actually decline on the basis of fuel in November and in December. The concern that the Reserve Bank has is that people are not going to look at this statistically and they'll say, oh, prices are rising, let's pass on this for businesses who will say, well, our costs are rising, let's pass on now and raise our prices high. The other piece of good news is that, ironically, South Africa's inflation rate is actually lower than that of the majority of major economies, which are now in double-digit territory. And that is in part because the impact of fuel prices and food is not quite as great on our economy as it is on theirs. And secondly, our economy is unfortunately, the very fact that there's load shedding and the economy is weak means that businesses are very aware that if they raise their prices too high, people will not buy their product and will just go without. Whereas in a country like the United States, where there was massive fiscal and monetary stimulus through COVID, and when COVID ended, people started spending like crazy. The concern there is that prices are rising also because demand is exceeding supply. That's not so much the case in South Africa.
So 7.8, you believe that may have been the peak. So now we're coming off that slightly. So then for how long? Because the Reserve Bank governor is saying we're still going to have some hikes. Why do we still have to have hikes if we've come off our peak? And for how long will we see hikes, do you think?
Unfortunately, the reason we have to hike is because we're part of a global economy. And the Americans and the Europeans are now hiking. And if we don't keep pace, investors are going to trash the rand and pull their money out and put it into dollars and euros because they'll start getting a decent return on those. Right now, until recently, the attraction of the rand has been that we offer higher interest rates than most other countries, and therefore it has paid to have some of your money in rands. If we don't keep pace with that, then we will see the rand falling sharply. It has already depreciated, but nowhere near as much as it could depreciate if we weren't to raise interest rates. The second reason for raising interest rates is the Reserve Bank is also concerned about rising wage inflation. The standoff with the public servants is an example where one of the reasons why the Reserve Bank's raising interest rates is just to show public servants, if you don't listen to the government and you still go out on strike, etc., well, then you'll be faced with still higher interest rates. As to how long this will go is the billion or trillion dollar question globally. There are those who believe that the central banks around the world will hesitate in carrying on raising interest rates because of the damage that this will do to global economic activity. And there are others who believe they just have to carry on doing so even into next year because inflation has gone out of control.
All right, so I'm going to ask you to give your guess of how many more when are we going to get our next rate increase, and what do you think it's likely to be? And will that be our last one before the end of the year?
It's almost certain that we will get a rate increase in 3 weeks' time. And the order of magnitude, the general expectation right now is another 0.75%. And there's an expectation that in the next one would be in January, we could get another 0.25% or 0.5% on top of that. I'm optimistic that beyond that, we're not going to get further rate increases. And the good news about that is that your prime overdraft rate shouldn't rise much above 10.5%, maybe 11%. And when you bear in mind that it was already at those levels pre-COVID, you know, the interest rates, ironically, in South Africa of 10 and 11% prime are actually quite low by historical standards. That's not to say that it's going to be easy, but relatively speaking, it's not quite as bad as what we have experienced for many, many years in the past.
Yeah, that's a very good point that you make. I want to ask you about Eskom, because we know that Eskom is really going through a very difficult time trying to keep the lights on. But Moody's this week upgraded them from, I think, a negative to a stable outlook. Or I'm not too sure what the grading was, but it was an improvement. So we know the power utilities is a key indicator of our economy. It's so central. Is this a sign that Eskom is turning a corner? Could it be a sign that other institutions are going to look up? What do you make of this upgraded rating?
Part of it is due to the fact that Eskom's debt has not risen too much over the last couple of years. It was already over 400 billion rand a couple of years ago. It's been making some inroads in preventing that debt level from rising. And secondly, the Minister of Finance made it quite clear in the MTVPS last week that the government wants to take on at least a third, maybe up to 2/3 of that debt onto its own balance sheet. What that would then do is allow Eskom to concentrate on running its business first and foremost properly, rather than worrying about creating enough cash with which to pay off interest on its debt. So it appears as if the government's move to promise to take some of that debt onto its own balance sheet has psychologically been the right thing for the markets. It does, of course, mean that taxpayers will have to bear the brunt a little more, but, you know, they've been having to bear the brunt in terms of load shedding and higher electricity tariffs. So, you know, what you gain with one hand, you lose on the other. So it's not but the markets seem to prefer the idea that the government has that debt on its own balance sheet. And in relation to total government debt of 5 trillion rand, taking on 200 billion rands worth of Eskom debt would increase our total government debt by no more than 3 or 4%, and our interest payments would rise no more than that amount from the government's point of view, and relieve Eskom of that burden. And the same applies to a far smaller orders of magnitude to many of the other state-owned enterprises. Let them get on with the business of running their businesses properly, rather than worrying about paying off the interest on their debts as number one priority.
All right. Well, thank you for that perspective and the little silver linings you're giving us this evening, that we hopefully will only have 2 more rate hikes, the last one in January, and hopefully we can hang on until things get better. Thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. That's Dr. Azar Jammine. He's, of course, the chief economist at Econometrics. Now,